Ah, at last. It's almost over. We've reached the final challenge before I am free. The 3 giants are settled, and therein remains only the confusion and concern of the places around them. God grant me strength, for I am ready to be done. Greetings! I am the Hearth Guy, and it's time to wrap up this tour guide to Hearthlandia, or whatever you want to call this blasted continent. I have explained in more detail than I care for about Hoshido nor Anvala, but nothing exists in a vacuum, and while the landmass these nations sit on is a mystery, their surroundings are actually granted the privilege of a name. Naturally, in the shadow of the twin warring kingdoms, we find places that are trying their best to be as forgettable as feasibly possible. But alas for them, I do not forget. As though cursed for the sin of playing this game, I have been condemned to aimlessly ponder about the stray, random tribes and countries in this nameless land, and what on earth are they getting up to? Because it has got to be better than the nonsense I'm dealing with following this circus around for the next dozen hours or so. So come along with me, ye tourists, as I learn you all some absolutely pointless information, laced with an unhealthy amount of conjecture, since the actual tangible info we have on most of these places wouldn't even fill a thimble. To keep this somewhat coherent, we're going to start with the first of these secondary groups we have even the slightest interaction with. Afterwards, we'll go into some of the weirder places in this setting that don't properly show up on the map. Expect plenty of theory crafting and speculation on how half these places work, though. Starting with...
This first song is called A World on Fire.
The Flame Tribe is made up of what I can only assume to be the most unpleasant kind of people. When your only representative and future leader is a violent, borderline misanthrope, it gives the impression that you're okay with her going around acting like this. Which lines up pretty well with everything we learn about it from Rinka, said future leader. The exact location of the tribe is never shown, but we know it's somewhere in the north of Hoshido and is situated at the base of a volcano. That's at least sort of active, since it erupted in recent enough memory for there to be stories about it, and how it was all an outsider's fault for extinguishing the tribe's holy flame. Said flame is something they keep perpetually lit as an act of worship to the flame god. Who is the flame god? Don't know, but considering this land's history and the fact that we know there were at least 12 dragons running around, 7 of which we have next to no information on, I'll just assume the flame god was one of those dragons. If you're wondering who the 5 we know the names of are, a few of them are obvious. Anankos, the Dusk Dragon, the Dawn Dragon, the Rainbow Sage, and Moro, the Astral Dragon, that Lilith is always mentioning. Those last 2 will be a little bit relevant later. But it seems to be a trend that every major culture has a dragon somehow associated with them, even if they don't realize it. So my best bet is that's what's going on with the God of Flames. I suppose the Flame God could just be a normal god the Flame Tribe are worshipping, but come on, it's Fire Emblem. It's almost always dragons. And also, like other examples of tribal leadership, Rinka can produce actual fire in combat as a way to attack. It could just be for the sake of gameplay and aesthetics, but a couple examples later on can do the same thing, so maybe this is an example of dragon blood or some kind of dragon magic from way in the past. That one might be a bit of a stretch, but I'm working with almost nothing here. Back to the main point. Because of the Flame God's teachings and probably helped by outsiders regularly screwing with their holy flame, the Flame Tribe doesn't really do a lot of diplomacy. Best case scenario, you're going to be gently removed from their property, and worst case, they'll just beat you to death for stepping on their lawn. The isolationist mindset extends to various parts of the tribe's culture too, with more emphasis being put on individual strength rather than strength in numbers. At least if we're to take Rinka as an example. They can still fight in groups and perform basic strategies, and will choose retreat over dying a pointless death if it can be avoided, but paradoxically they prefer death in battle over being captured. Bit of a weird hierarchy of honor there, but whatever. In spite of all of this, whenever Nor started doing what Nor does, which is being the worst, the Flame Tribe officially allied with Hoshido, an apparently unprecedented move. As a show of that alliance, Rinka got sent to help out the royals whenever they needed her. Outside of that, the Flame Tribe doesn't really do anything we can see. They're so far removed from everything that it's hard to tell why they even bothered allying with Hoshido in the first place. But Rinka's father seems convinced Nor would be a problem for them too. Who am I to disagree with a man we never see? He does have Fuga's respect, and Fuga's a pretty cool dude, so he has my confidence. I mean, just look at his uncanny muscles. I'd trust that.
There's no war in Ba Sing Se.
This one is a little bit weird. Igasato is a settlement somewhere in the northwest mountains of Hoshido, and it's run by ninjas. In fact, a whole clan of ninjas whose heads are all named Saizo. Saizo the 1st, 2nd, 3rd, etc., etc. They seem to function like a part of Hoshido, a special place where the ninja class of the kingdom are raised and trained to serve the crown, but they also have a strange level of independence. The Saizo clan all wind up serving as retainers for the highest part of the Hoshidan royal family, but at the same time, they have free reign to investigate into other countries without seemingly any oversight, as well as said ninja being allowed to be hired by people other than the royal family. I say this because Saizo the 4th and 5th, despite being retainers, were actively looking into Mokushu's daimyo, Kotaro, without anyone else seeming to know about it. Despite having several ninjas who come from this place in the Hoshidan army, we get very little about Igasato itself. We know that they value an almost Spartan way of life, fill out the ranks of Hoshido's army with ninja, and for whatever reason they act more like a vassal of Hoshido than a part of it. There's not even any mythology to speculate about. They're just a village of ninjas hidden in the mountains, whose leaders like naming their sons after themselves. Moving on. Now we are getting into something genuinely interesting and low-key confusing. Of the tribes on the continent of El Dorado, the Wind Tribe appears to be the most well-developed and powerful. Where others are relegated to a single village or vassals to others, the Wind Tribe can lay claim to the entire southwestern Badlands and the eternal staircase between Hoshido and Izumo, and even boasts a rather impressive fortress that we all know as Mr. Fuga's Wild Ride. The Wind Tribe, despite its name, is more of a small kingdom with how it's able to demand neutrality in the conflict between Nor and Hoshido. Even in Conquest, the most that they do is force Korin to take a trip on the Fuga coaster before letting them pass on through, which isn't how neutrality works, but don't worry about it. Why do they keep to neutrality when Nor is actively encroaching on their land and getting their civilians killed just to frame Korin? Great question, but just assume they didn't think about it. That's usually the right answer. It makes even less sense when you know that Fuga was best friends with Sumeragi, the late king of Hoshido that Garen turned into a porcupine, and is widely considered the greatest fighter who ever lived, and that's not my words. The ending slides say that themselves. But he only joins up in Revelations, which might be just the worst possible time to do so. By this point in the story, most of the major players are off in Vala, Izumo's lost its leader, Nor's making attacks on the Hoshidan capital, and Garen has somehow become so laughably evil that not even Xander Pog I just murdered my sister Fire Emblem could possibly pretend he was fine. In all of this, Fuga decides to join the war effort because this time they get to kill a dragon. Neat. Let's just hope someone's around to actually lead this place when you join the other bozos in the Upside Down. Unlike the Flame Tribe, the Wind Tribe doesn't appear to have any god of wind they worship, but more follow a general philosophy that uses wind as a metaphor. I assume anyway, that's the best I've got. Fuga makes wind blasts when he hits stuff, so maybe there was a wind dragon somewhere in the past. But the tribal dragon thing is all a theory anyway. A game theory! My only last note is that the Wind Tribe doesn't seem too caught up on the bloodline succession, unlike most other places, since Fuga's adoptive son Hayato becomes chief after him even if Fuga's had a kid with Korin. Sure, Kana can technically not exist at all, and the one timeline he can with Fuga as his dad, he'd be the heir to Vala anyway, but just because Fates didn't think that far ahead, doesn't mean I have to ignore it. It's all going into the great book of nonsense that is Fates lore, and I will expect you to take notes. If you have been already, good job. I'm proud of you. Now, anything else? I guess the Wind Tribe seems to value interaction with its neighbors more than other tribes, and Fuga at least knows a lot about the continent's history and mythology, but that seems to be a personal thing. As for anything we could get out of Hayato, Honestly, nothing of value here. And no, I refuse to comb through the clown supports to find any valuable information. I just won't. I have suffered enough from this experience. I won't deep dive into Hayato's inferiority complex and his eternal babyface. You can't make me.
Begone, vile man! Begone from me!
First of the furry clans, the Kitsune hamlet lies between Izumo and the Wind Tribe, and are considered a likable and generally beautiful people, until they eat your face off for showing up on their doorstep. See, after generations of being hunted for their pelts, the Kitsune developed an extreme version of American home defense philosophy that means if you're breathing the same air as their village, then you're on the chopping block. Meet them outside that territory and you're golden. They'll be your best friend. Otherwise, good luck. Does it make any real sense? Not whenever you consider that their only reason for attacking you in Conquest is because you happen to be there. Even though Korin and friends were actively trying to avoid them, makes the Kitsune out to be a lot more bloodthirsty than you'd assume. And yet we're supposed to feel bad for this insane idea of border patrol? It's one thing to turn you away at the base of the mountain, it's another to send the army of shadow clones or whatever they're pulling off here to tear you to pieces because someone took the wrong turn. Their leader, Kaden, even knows that Korin's telling the truth about just passing through, but the man can only follow a single thought process without spiraling, apparently, since he decides to kill them all anyway. Worse yet, Kaden kind of likes to disappear on a whim, as he has this compulsory need to repay debts to people with kind actions, and that led him in 2 of the 3 routes to get so far from home he needed to tag along with an army to not get lost again. Does this affect the hamlet that their leader disappears at random? Don't know, we never get an answer for that. I guess it'd be like if your mayor decided to go on a year-long party cruise around the world. Izumo is all the worst traits of a stereotypical, peace-loving neutral nation wrapped together, with some of the most confusing, half-baked background lore imaginable. So, where to begin? Well, to start, it's bordering Mokushu, the problem child of the region, and chose to do nothing whenever Mokushu annihilated their neighbor of Koga, and annexed its land. This alone might not seem like too much, after all, it's not their problem, right? See, that is until you consider the fact that Izana, Izumo's ruling archduke, gets replaced by a Norian mage in every single route. Izana gets shoved into his own prison cell for however long, and when he comes out, the most you can expect him to do is personally join your army if your hot springs are a high enough level. This whole thing is like a vacation for him, and in some ways, he's not even wrong to do so. Izana is considered a descendant of the gods, which directly plays a part in his gift for prophecy. This is actually corroborated by the fact that Korin, child of Anankos who is also a god, had at least one instance of dreaming of the future. Perhaps Izumo was once a part of Vala or some other dragon pulled in Anankos and got freaky with some humans, but either way, Izumo's been built around this air of sanctity and prophecy for as long as anyone can remember. This sacred image fuels and reinforced their neutrality, although we never got a solid answer as to why this place is called the Land of the Gods besides that fact. Maybe this was where the dragons originally hung about, maybe the land is especially full of dragon veins, maybe this is where the dragons ascended to the astral realm. Maybe Izumo scammed the rest of the continent into believing any of this and there's actually nothing special about anything here. Something must be going on because they can afford to be neutral while all this nonsense is going on, and they can afford for the Archduke's lavish lifestyle. That said, Izana is legitimately able to see the future and has been able to commune with the gods on a regular basis. With a power like that, maybe he's just really good with stocks. In all seriousness, which is difficult for me without my brain melting during this whole experience, it's hard to tell what exactly Izumo does half the time. It provides healers, luxuries, and fortune-telling, but besides perhaps some cultural significance, I'm not sure what's supposed to stop Mokushu from attacking them as well. Hoshido? Sure, Mokushu couldn't have handled that on their own, but I struggle to understand what stopped them from attacking Izumo as well. Or why Izumo has nothing to say about Mokushu obliterating Koga. In 2 separate routes, the party is on their way to Mokushu after Izumo, and they never get any warning that, hey, the place you're about to walk into is led by a bloodthirsty warmonger. Seriously, why does this never get mentioned? I feel like it should be way more important. And why does the supposed peace-loving Azumo just never do anything or comment? Neutrality is one thing, inaction is another. They really tried hard to sell this idea of Azumo's neutrality and it being a virtue until you remember that their leader will just ignore that in 2 routes and then dies in the other one. Unless he has a sibling he never mentions, then Azumo's screwed while he's away during Birthright and Conquest and permanently in Revelation. But I guess this is what happens when your death exclusively exists to, for about 5 minutes, make the golden route seem somehow like it's supposed to be a hard decision to make whenever it's obviously not. Moving on, I'm going to crash out at this rate.
F is for fire that burns down the whole town, used for uranium bombs. N is for no survivors.
With how much I've used Mokushu to explain how other nations aren't acting right, you would think there would be more to say about the place. The fact is that both it and its leader, Kotaro, are better identified by the sheer depth of what they get away with. Not their culture, of which all we can assume is that they specialize in traps based off how many spikes they have lying around. Certainly not how they treat their neighbors, for pick a reason. Not even for being particularly good at war, since they got summarily dismantled in every route, usually because Saizo is too angry to die, and Kotaro has a bad habit of yoinking Kagero. Sure, you can blame that on Corn Pop rolling up with their glorified bodyguards and actual god weapons to dropkick Kotaro into the pavement, but he's already doing everything in his power to get his name put on a Hoshiden hit list. I guess it shouldn't surprise me that they're bad at war when it seems like they don't have buildings. Of the grand total of their 2 maps we engage in the whole game, they are a forest and a cave, in which the most infrastructure we see is a gate and chests. Mokushu somehow got this far maxing out their intrigue tech tree, but refused to put a single point into infrastructure. At this rate, I'd be less surprised if you told me they don't actually have houses and just live in caves because it's more ninja-like or whatever. Or maybe they just hate walls. Not gonna lie, having played the original Ninja Gaiden, they screwed me over more times than I cared to admit, so I'd believe it. This place is about as deep as a kiddie pool with thumbtacks dropped in the bottom, so let's move on.
You are a pirate!
Keeping this one brief because we never see anything of it and just know it was somewhere in what is now Mokushu. It was conquered back when Shura was still a kid, implying Kotaro's older than he looks, and that whatever was left of it got totally obliterated by the house-hating Mokushijins. Unlike Igasato, which sounds like a military camp 24/7, or Mokushu, whose entire population is like if Starscream was a ninja, Koga sounds like a chill place that happened to train ninjas that regularly wound up serving Hoshida's royal family. Why the Hoshiden royals didn't punish Mokushu is anyone's guess, but I've wasted enough time on that. Koga's dead and only comes back if Shura survives long enough to see it made real. We literally never meet anybody else from Koga, so Shura and his 2 support conversations with the different flavors of popcorn are all we get. Saves me some time, I guess.
Ba, hababa, hababadagada, hababadadaba, hatabadagadaga.
Okay. Notre Sagesse is really weird. We get just about 4 facts on it, although the 4th one is a bit of headcanon, I will admit. First, it's called the Nation of Philosophers, which creates this image that besides being neutral, it is more of an academic hub than anything else. And if you'll mind the speculation, I believe it's actually more than the one village and monastery that we see. All of these islands make up the country of Notre Sagesse, which I believe since no other nation seems to have claimed them. Neither Nor nor Hoshido, try saying that 5 times fast, have shown to have a very prevalent navy, to such a degree that on multiple routes, Korin's army has to track down a boat to hire rather than just having a military vessel they can take. Thirdly, Notre Sagesse, likely because of the above-mentioned traits, can't defend itself at all. Both Hoshido and Nor can occupy the place with no problem, and that's when actively fighting a war against each other. Being an island nation of academics near nations that do their war on land probably has something to do with that. And the 4th fact that we can assume is that, unlike the rest of the continent, Notre Sagesse never really worshipped the dragon associated with it, that being the one who now goes by the Rainbow Sage. Besides being a land of philosophers rather than priests, if they did worship their local dragon, then I somehow doubt they'd fail to remember or talk about the fact that said dragon became the Rainbow Sage. If I can lean into fanfic territory, the best explanation would be that, following the war where he created the holy weapons and directly got mankind involved, and then was cursed to live until he had atoned, the Rainbow Sage wasn't too keen on being worshipped, and either erased his own existence as a dragon or outright directed Notre Sagesse to not worship him. Maybe the fact he stays up in a monastery at the top of a supposedly impassable mountain surrounded by magically summoned soldiers is to further separate himself from any would-be supplicants. Honestly, probably for the best, since the sage dies in every rout. Would probably put them all in a rough spot if their god died during the equivalent of a world war. Another theory, Anankos is the one who punished him and made him immortal until he'd atoned. Anankos was one of the first dragons, and the Yato the Sage made and the prophecies surrounding it seem to relate to Anankos. So, perhaps Anankos made sure the Sage would be around for whenever the Yato would be needed to be used against him. All interesting ideas that, of course, the game never actually says, and I had to extrapolate and for about 80% of it just make up based on what scant clues we have. Out of all the side nations, Nestra has to be the one that intrigues me most. To get the reasons that annoy me out of the way, it's a kingdom, or a duchy in the Japanese, that directly borders Nor, whose leaders we never see. Even though you would think you'd have to be pretty strong-willed or charismatic to avoid getting annexed when your neighbor is Garen. But apparently not strong-willed enough if both Hoshido and Nor disrespect your sovereignty whenever they like, since across all routes we see Nestra being brutalized by Hoshido and Nor. In Birthright and Conquest, the Hoshidans straight up use the Opera House as a means to try and assassinate Garen while he's on vacation, never bothering to ask whether the people running the place would appreciate that. And in Conquest, Garen's response to this, and Azura secretly trying to cast a spell on Garen with song, is to hunt down and kill every dancer in the capital of Circensia. Because surely the king or duke or whatever wouldn't mind him doing that, right? Just some casual slaughter of not just innocents, but likely some of the most favored people in their society if Nestra is so well known for its luxury and opera houses. And in Revelations, Circensia is outright demolished by Valites, while Xander and Ryoma spend the whole time blaming each other and fighting, further breeding chaos in the streets while Corrin and friends just leave the ruined capital as they found it. Sure hope no one's buried under the rubble of these buildings that, as Caden and Keaton said, just magically started falling apart. And Nestra better hope that there's no repercussions from having their center of trade, culture, and power getting knocked over by, as far as anyone can tell, the future leaders of 3 nations beating each other up. Seriously, Revelations is looking more and more like it exclusively exists to make the side nations suffer. Fuga and Hayato can just up and leave, Izana dies, Kotaro dies, the Sage dies, Nestra becomes rubble, and we haven't even gotten to Shev or the Ice Tribe. What, were they just vibing too much, and intelligent systems decided they needed to suffer like the players who had to pay $20 for this mess? Whatever. Time to talk about something I like before I lose it. Nestra's got probably my favorite aesthetic of any of the nations. Not any of the side nations, any of the nations, period. Don't care about Nor or Hoshido, I'm repping Nestra Castle style. Give me some more Venetian-style fantasy settings, please! It also paints an interesting picture of the only country to be doing all right during all the chaos of the war, making a profit from the luxury it provides for peoples of all nations. They're apparently the only place where you can find a decent boat around here, too. And Circensia isn't the only place that gets denigrated by their neighbors, cause the port of Dia is assaulted by Nor and Hoshido and gets their harbor drained in Conquest and Revelation, which will surely have a negative impact on the trout population. I also sincerely hope the water comes back after they dragon-veined the ocean, because Nestra being generationally defiled by everyone else is getting comical at this point. Since they seem to be the one place with any good naval capabilities, it does make me wonder what would happen if, in some future of Fates, Nestra could dominate the waters the way Nor and Hoshido dominate the lands. Is this hopeful thinking because I'd want a Venetian empire that isn't tainted by the writing of this game? Absolutely. And I won't be apologizing for it.
We've been at a 90% casualty rate for a month.
Shev's purpose in Fates is to get sucker punched and laughed at for fun to drive home that Nor sucks. I know I could say that about quite a few of these places, but Shev gets it the worst. Mostly for no reason. Shev is kind of and kind of not a nation, though. It's got a distinct culture and lays outside the border wall of Nor, though, so I'm just assuming to be safe. A land of knights, it's currently in rebellion against Nor, but said rebellion is doomed. Its leader, Scarlet, dies in 2 routes and gets dragged off to join the Hoshidans after her secret base gets raided, so I don't have high hopes for how that resistance went in the long run. Without a leader, Shev gets brutalized in Nor as revenge and conquest, and I can only imagine it goes about the same way in Birthright and Revelation. Maybe not so much in Birthright, since they'd be so focused on tracking down the entire army that they managed to lose at their borders, but we got no info on what Garen was up to during the latter half of Revelation, so I can only assume it wasn't anything good. Sucks to be Shev, my man.
Greetings, traveler. I am the Pitbull of the Woods. Have you seen any orphanages nearby?
The Wolfskins, by nature, have a lot of the same stuff going on that the Kitsune do. Territorial, they kill humans who come near, although unlike the Kitsune, it's suggested that the Wolfskins eat people. Unless I'm misremembering that part. So that's a lovely idea to have when Keaton, their leader, is in your army. That said, another distinction from the Kitsune is that the Wolfskin are smack dab in the middle of Nor. Their home of Mount Garo is such a death trap that supposedly the Norian army just doesn't bother going there. Which is either bad writing, because they're trying to tell me that the conquest-obsessed Garen wouldn't throw bodies at the cannibal wolf people just because he can, or bad writing because if the Wolfskin are really that dangerous, then why on earth are they open to letting Corrin's group pass by their home in Birthright? Sure, they still fought, but that was only after Iago caused an attack that killed one of the Wolfskins. Although considering all the nonsense that goes on Mount Garo in that chapter, I probably shouldn't be surprised, though I digress. Keaton also likes to vanish at random points because his sense of direction is suspiciously bad for a guy who can smell one of his people from miles away. But that's the least of the inconsistencies to consider here. Don't even get me started on the things they turn into. Excuse me, this is not a wolf. This is a freaking ogre.
I'd like to go on record as being opposed to the use of violence for purposes of conflict resolution. However...
Last of the elemental tribes and last of the proper nations, the Ice Tribe was conquered by Garen and turned into a vassal sometime around when Corrin was a child, as shortly after, Felicia and Flora, the daughters of the chief, were taken as hostages and made Corrin's servants. The Ice Tribe, as compared to the Wind and Flame tribes, appear to have the most obvious control over their respective elements. Flora, Felicia, and probably their father Kilma can all manipulate ice and cold at will, and this appears to be something all of the tribe have some control over. They can ignore blizzards, summon ice, and in Revelations, the tribe working together froze an entire chunk of the ocean, which is horrifying when you consider how cold it has to be to freeze salt water like that. Really makes you wonder how the Ice Tribe even got conquered in the first place. Besides Ice Age causing magic and being stationed in the one place they should have unlimited power, they still get overwhelmed both in the lore and in every route where you fight them. What is stopping them from just giving an entire army hypothermia? If you can freeze the ocean, then surely lowering the temperature on an approaching enemy can't be that hard. I suppose if the enemy is throwing around dragon veins, then it would even the odds, but how many dragon veins have to be nearby for your abilities that work all of the time to be overwhelmed? Heck, despite being beaten and punched back into submission in Birthright and Conquest, Revelation just outright tells us that the Ice Tribe can go into hiding in the tundra and totally avoid detection by Nor. They apparently do so successfully since Flora can join you later without any worry. So why do you not do that in the first place? You're trying to convince me none of you had this same thought to just walk into the snow and let the elements deal with your invaders for you? This isn't rocket science, it's just common sense. You guys are resistant to the cold. They aren't, just wait them out. Forget it. Forget it. Not worth the hassle. I'm done. Besides, we have something else to worry about. Because now that the nations are settled, let's talk about some of the most brain-bending parts of the setting.
She's sinking! The plot is sinking! Quick, hire the emergency writers!
This is the realm that the dragons went to after shedding their physical forms. At one point, according to Lilith, it was populated. Probably by dragons, but Lilith states this is no longer the case. For whatever reason, they left this level of the astral plane too, and Lilith is the only one with direct access to the castle. Since Moro, the astral dragon, is given that title, I would wager it was his idea and he had the most sway over the entire place. And if you believe Lilith, he still appears to have a measure of influence over that realm, and those who are bound to it like her. He grants her the power to access the castle where Corrin's army is stationed between battles, and lets her take human form every so often. Outside the castle, however, there's not much else that we see. Various supports take place at the army camp, which I assume is the castle, and they also speak about traveling to nearby villages and whatnot. Now, could this mean that they exit the astral plane to do so? Sure. And maybe they have a traveling camp they use when they're on the move, and the castle when they're already where they need to be. It's also pretty clear that there are just portals to pockets of the astral plane littered across the continent, which we'll talk about in a bit. Trust me. So interactions with outside villages, or even cases where enemies sneak into the camp, could happen because of that, but I'm pretty sure we all know it's because the writers of the supports didn't think to take into account the fact that the castle is effectively a pocket dimension over which Lilith is the god. We can justify it however we like, but at a point we have to accept the reality. They forgore. The astral castle itself isn't a huge issue. The real problem comes from a different aspect of the astral plane.
I am sorry. I am just absolutely livid at the moment.
I hate the Deep Realms. I hate the Deep Realms. I hate the Deep Realms. Now that we know where we stand, what are the Deep Realms? Well, in simplest terms, they are pocket dimensions scattered across the astral plane that, through mostly undetectable portals, the characters of Fates can find and throw their children into for safekeeping. Slight problem. Time is dilated within these pocket dimensions, so after a few months, these kids are nearly fully grown because years have passed inside. As you can imagine, 1, it's very strange, and 2, it makes things tense for almost every single one of them. A few of them are pretty cavalier about it, but the rest have some degree of daddy issues, since all but 2 are directly tied to their father for gameplay purposes. The rate of time passing isn't even standard across the multiple Deep Realms, so one can be a couple years in a month, while the other can pop out with a kid now being older than their parents are, aka Rashad. Now, I could go on about how, if this is the case, then there's no good reason for the parents not to spend more time with their children, since it's quite literally would take less time for them to do so. But for some of them, like Ryoma or Xander, I understand you can't afford to be gone for a whole week. But chumps like Benny or Hayato have no excuse. What do you guys do that's so important that you can't expend the equivalent of vacation days to properly be present in your kids' lives? Ridiculous. No, the real problem is that the Deep Realms open such convoluted plot holes that I can't even begin to understand what convinced them this was a good idea. To start, if you have a series of hyperbolic time chambers that not only have entire towns and people living their whole lives in these places, why don't you use them? You're already dropping your kids inside and betting on them being okay. But do you understand the logistics of saying, okay, we have some injured soldiers, let's throw them in here for a bit as a few months pass inside, and wow, look at that, they're all healed. Or, need to train a bunch of recruits? Easy. Just walk through this portal and let the boot camp fly by to all of us out here so we can rapidly fill our army slots with people. It's bad enough that the castle Corrin's army is stationed in is in a part of the astral plane where time definitely doesn't move normally, but that they can also have access to ones where time moves faster is just, did no one realize how they could abuse this? That's not even covering the logistics of each individual one. Are they all entire worlds to themselves? Or is there a point where they just stop? Like being out of bounds, there's just an invisible wall where the universe decides to no longer continue. If there's open space in some of these, why doesn't the army also use them to maximize production of vital resources? Some even have dragon veins, so you could give yourself a surplus of food and equipment. You wouldn't even need to take up that much space, since you're already producing at a relatively rapid rate. Try saying that 5 times fast. Deep Realms are one of the most puzzling and underutilized ideas ever to exist in a Fire Emblem game, and I hate every second that their existence takes up space in my mind.
Well, you got me. By all accounts, it doesn't make sense.
I've been waiting for this one. Ylisse is the home nation of the Shepherds from Fire Emblem Awakening, and for some reason you can just walk right into there from the castle in Fates. Because reasons. Why is Jalise here? Why are we able to travel to a time before the events of Awakening, meanwhile the people actually from Awakening are here from after? Why does Crom talk about Hoshido and Nor as these mythical kingdoms of legend, meanwhile the trio act as if they've never heard of them? There's just a random portal of this kind hanging around the castle that can circumvent time itself, that opens up into the middle of Ylisse. Is that why there are stories of Hoshido and Nor? Well, that seems pretty unlikely since their army's castle is in the astral plane. It doesn't make any sense. That's it. That's it. I'm done. I'm done. I'm done. I'm done. I am done. I have to wrap up the video. At the end of the day, I am forced to accept that Fire Emblem Fates was indeed my very first Fire Emblem game, and it forever laid its claws inside me. I can't help that the gameplay is indeed stellar, even as half the characters make me roll my eyes, and the world building confuses me to a degree that's frankly unhealthy. And do I ramp up the reaction for the sake of a video? A little bit. But they're still true to what I think and feel about it all. The lore of Fates was a part of a large document that the original writers apparently made, and then they proceeded to condense all of that into the story between 3 routes, and added a bunch of other stuff to justify certain events and gameplay mechanics in such a way that I don't think they considered the ramifications. But I think I got that point across well enough. And I think my throat and brain can use a break, so let's call it a day, yeah? Thank you immensely for sticking around for this chaotic nonsense that is Fire Emblem Fates. And I hope that some part of this was informative, entertaining, or at least cathartic if you've had these same observations. A massive shout out to all my patrons and channel members tolerating my random hyperfixations and inspiring me to continue acquiring said hyperfixations like their trophies. Especially my newest patrons, Cello Aten, who actually has the power to create the most beautiful song you've ever heard out of thin air. Yes, before you ask, it's just Darude Sandstorm. And JBrody14, the 14th in a long line of Jabrodis, who are said to protect mankind. From what you may ask? Overuse of outdated slang from the 70s and 80s. I'd appreciate anyone, patron, member, or not, to do all the YouTube stuff. You know, liking, commenting, and all that before you go, and supporting the channel in your own way. Watching this far does a lot too, and I thank you for getting here. With Fates behind me, I can truly consider that dark period of my life tucked away and reconciled so I can look towards newer, better things. Remember, I am the Hearth Guy, and say it with me now, I will see you all next time, around the hearth. What? You think I'm gonna let this cash cow go? No, 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 no. I recognize money when I see it. And I still got 9 entire holds to look at. Got to fill the endless wait for Elder Scrolls 6 somehow, right?